And so our next session is the session on law and policy. And could we have our moderator, please?
Yes. So let's move to session 3, restitution, law and policy. So let's welcome the moderator, Stephen Pan. 接下来我们将开始专题分享文物返还、法律与政策。有请主持人潘守勇，大家欢迎。
Good morning. Session 3, restitution, repatriation, law, and policy. Very briefly introduce myself. Me from Shanghai University. My name is Stephen Pan, or also call me Xiaoyong Pan. I'm a library director here. My office door is very close to this building, so you can next door to the lecture hall. Before I came to Shanghai University, I had been working in National Minority University for almost 28 years. I work with a national ethnic group community with their library heritage issue, and also I work with the Chinese Tanbo heritage law, and also we work with ICOM Museum at Anji and Taihang area, so I'm very familiar with ethnic minority communities. This session we have 3 speakers. The first speaker is Yunxia Wang, who's the professor of law and the UNESCO chair on cultural heritage from Law School, Renmin University, Beijing, the University of China, Beijing, and also he's the director of the Cultural Heritage Law Institute. The second speaker is Professor. I try to proper pronunciation. So Americo Castilla. Okay. He's the director and the founder of the TIPA Lab and the Museum Management Argentina. The third speaker, I mean here, all the audience they are familiar with is Professor Duan Yong. He's the Vice Chancellor of Shanghai University, also the director of the Chinese Overseas Cultural Heritage Studies, and also he's the co-chair of the ICOM IMREC. And also he's the co-organizer of this conference. So please welcome, please join me to welcome the first speaker, Professor Wang.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Professor Wang Yunxia from Renmin University, and it's my great pleasure to join this marvelous event. And for my convenience, I would prefer to speak in my mother tongue. Excuse me.
So good morning. I'm from Renmin University. I'm also the moderator of UNESCO Chair of Cultural Heritage Law. So I'm very happy to be able to give the talk at this important event. I'm actually a layman of museum, but I study cultural heritage law, and I'm really interested in relics restitution and repatriation, especially the restitution of those illicitly transferred objects. I've studied such topics of the objects involved in the Second World War. Then the France chancellor also mentioned that they would like to return some of the colonial objects obtained from Africa and now stored in the museums of France. This event for myself is astonishing.
So since then, I began to pay more attention to the legal issues related to the restitution of the colonial cultural relics, but this is indeed a niche field in China, so I'm extremely happy to have this opportunity to have the in-depth discussions on the legal issues in this field. Well, firstly, I want to make it clear that when we talk about the restitution of colonial cultural relics, refers to the restitution of illegally transferred cultural relics. So in this context, it only refers to the claims of the colonized countries for the colonial cultural relics, but also refer to the restitutions that are caused by unfair transactions, involuntary gifts or confiscations, expropriations, and other acts. So it involves the war, loot activities. It will also involve the transactions, involuntary gifts, etc. So I think for this topic, from the perspective of the law, it is very complex. Yesterday, many experts have underscored the issue that maybe this cannot be solved only by law. Of course, this is also relevant with the perspective you take, because different laws may offer you different facets. So it is indeed very complex. First is because it didn't have the direct legal basis. We don't have international conventions to regulate this. For the existing international conventions, what they focus, what is the preservations of the cultural relics during war. Of course, this is the Haiti law, and also it was established in 1954. And so in this law, it has stipulations as how to prevent looting during the war, etc. However, once the cultural relics that have been dislocated or that have been stolen, as how to do the restitution, there is no specific regulations in this convention. And of course, in this convention, many scholars hold that it has laid foundations for multiple frameworks, legal frameworks to guide the restitution. So it has the law force of the international law. Therefore, for those contracting countries, it has the legal enforcement effects. And also, many of those international trials were based on the Hague Law or Hague Convention. And so for those trials, they do have the legal enforcement. And also for the new convention, they also have the relevations with the previous versions of the Hague Law. So it has the function of the international law, and we should pay attention to that. For other two conventions, I will refer to them very much. And one is the 1970 Convention of UNESCO. Another one is the 1995 Convention of UNIDROIT, So for the two conventions, they will just focus on the illicit trafficking of the cultural relics between countries. And once we have the illicit trafficking of the cultural relics, what can we do to have the restitution of the cultural relics to the source country? And for UNIVAC, from normally they will standardize the legitimate laws or the judicial regulations in a general principle, and also how can they make up for the well-kinded possessor of the cultural relics. And for the two conventions, actually for the illicit behaviors that they can handle are actually the behaviors that are under the scope of those contracted countries of those conventions. However, with the two conventions, as how to correct the illicit transactions or illicit behaviors related with the cultural relics, I think they also have some guidance value. So I think we can also refer to the two conventions. In addition to that, talking about laws, and people may say that you can go to the court once you identify that the inherited culturality of your family is now located at another person's home in Japan. So is it plausible for you to go to the court to, appeal for the restitution of the inherited culturality of your family? I think firstly, you should follow the international law. Firstly, and you should also abide by the law of the local country of the possession of the cultural relics. And it has the due or the time limit for the appeal. And for historic translocation or dislocation of the cultural relics normally happened 100, 200, 3 years ago. If you don't change the current law system, then the time limit of the appeal will be a big barrier. And we also have many other barriers, for example, the evidence collection, and also the inseparability of the national treasure, etc. So all these are the legal barriers. Actually, in terms of the legal complexity, we also have another manifestation. For these issues, they are actually historic issues that have not been able to be solved in quite a long period of time. Actually, when we ended the war or the colonization, actually, for the countries that were at war, or the colonizers and the colonies, they would also sign legal agreements to have the reconciliation. However, since the 20th century, in very rare cases, for example, in 1919, they have some legal regulations involving the restitution of the cultural relics in the Versailles Convention. So for normally for those countries that just got out of the war, their priority is to restore their peace and also to reconstruct the country. Normally, the restitution of the cultural relics will normally be ignored. So if they don't deal with the restitution of the cultural relics, then it will become the historic legacy issue. And another important point about the legal difficulty is the lack of the international consensus in the world. Yesterday's session, we actually learned this issue in some countries. So in the possession country of the cultural relics, be it the museums or the collection institutions or individuals, they would be very objective, or they would be in the objection of the restitution of the cultural relics. The reason why they would be strongly opposing against it is because they think their acquirement or obtainment of those cultural relics are from legal channels. And also some of those cultural relics were stemmed from the archaeological activities in 19th century by Harvard University through the agreement. So they thought the channels were legal. Well, they would ignore the illicit colonial looting behind the so-called legal channels, because we don't have the international consensus behind it, so we cannot use the current legal systems to solve those problems. I understand it's quite difficult, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the international community should stand by doing nothing. Historically speaking, for illegally translocated or dislocated cultural relics, under their restitutions, we utilized a lot soft laws to facilitate the repatriation and restitution of the cultural relics to the source country or the illegal or the legal inheritance agency or person of the cultural relics. So I think that should also be a very important evidence and proof for us to solve those problems. What is the soft international law? Of course, it is not a very strict legal concept, and it's because the scholars think that for the enforceable laws, they do have the obligatory responsibilities sheltered to the contracting members and countries, so they can be called like the hard law. So it refers to the bilateral or multilateral agreements. In addition to that, for other agreements that have been constituted or signed by the international institutions or the international meetings, they are not obligatory because they only have the function of offering guidance. So we call them the soft law. Of course, they have different modalities. So, for example, we have the considerations from the UN General Assembly and also the considerations and documentations from the UNESCO, EU, etc. And it may also involve the announcements or the consensus, etc., that have been formulated by international parties during international meetings. It offers us the evidence to support the international negotiation. During the World War II, soft laws played a very important role in the restitution of the cultural relics that have been illegally taken during World War II. So just give you one example. In 1998, in Washington, D.C., the U.S. government summoned the representatives of more than 40 countries to solve the treasure issues and the restitutions of the treasures that have been taken during World War II for Jewish people. And so they actually formulated the Washington Principle for the restitution of the treasures belonging to Jewish people and that have been taken illegally during World War II. Even though it is not legally obligatory, it still has a very important role to play for those reconciliations, and it has been referred to by multiple legal cases, and also in the descendants negotiations. It has also a very important role to play. What I want to mention is and is the 1205 agreement by the European Commission about the Jewish people's treasure. Of course, it echoes with the Washington, D.C.'s principle, and they ask public institutions or private collectors and institutions to check that among your collections, whether there are any objects that have been taken illegally during the World War II and they belong to the Jewish people. If they are, you should do restitution as soon as possible.
So the 1205 document is mentioned because for the EU members, it is recommended that they update their national laws accordingly to minimize the barriers for return of Jewish collections. For example, the statute of limitation, the collection of good intention, or the exemption of responsibilities or obligations. European countries and nations have therefore amended their laws. It is also worth mentioning that in 1999, in January, ICOM once made a proposal on returning Jewish artworks to the owners. The proposal only has 4 sentences or 4 sub-proposals, but they are very persuasive. They really set the guide. That is, museums should have a quick look into their collections in terms of whether there are any Jewish collections that belong to the Jewish people. It is also required that they make public such information. It is also suggested that procedures be set up to allow the repatriation or return of such Jewish collections. I think that the objects looted in the Second War are really getting the attention, and such efforts can be applied for the repatriation, for the return of cultural relics. Why? Because first, regardless of whether it's the objects from the Second War or from the colonial context, they share the feature of lack of direct reference into international law, and also they both face barriers from domestic laws, and they are illegally obtained. Also, the illicit transfer during the Second War of objects many times are intertwined with the objects of colonial backgrounds. For example, Japan in 1905 started to colonize Pyongyang Peninsula, and this lasted until end of Second War. So the return of the Second War illicitly obtained objects is not a separate thing. So if we already have made efforts on the return and repatriation of objects illegally obtained during the Second War, why can't we apply the same doing for other cultural relics so that we can, apply such soft laws for the same concept? So I think that maybe it's time that we issue some declaration or resolution on return of colonial cultural relics. We actually have already had some experience. For example, France and Germany have had the policies on return of colonial cultural relics, and they have done the work. For example, France president has arranged an expert work team to return the African cultural relics. And Germany, with the leadership of the Museum of Germany, plus the efforts of the government of Germany, have both put into efforts activities of return some of the colonial background objects. But we have to understand that we cannot rely on policies alone. Policies sometimes can change, and also individual countries' acts cannot directly impact museums around the world. So I think that we should reference the soft laws for repatriation of the objects of the Second War, and also reference experience of France and Germany, and maybe ICOM or UNESCO can lead to produce some declaration or proposal on return of the colonial cultural relics. Of course, UNESCO might not be the appropriate one. Why is that? Because UNESCO once tried to do something for the repatriation return of the objects of the Second War. And they tried to put forward some soft law. Starting 2000, they have actually organized several expert sessions to write down the soft laws. It grew from 8 laws to now 16 laws. You can still find them on the UNESCO website about the principles and suggestions for the return of the objects of the Second War. But this effort is still going because some member countries, for example, Japan, really is against this activity. So therefore, this proposal or suggestion cannot pass. So maybe ICOM can be the one. And this is also the event of ICOM, so maybe ICOM can take the leadership to call on its members to put together this soft law. So ICOM might be the appropriate one doing this activity. I think that we need to clarify the scope and the target of return. So exactly what are the objects that should get the attention? We also need to pay attention to classification. So different categories of the objects should be subject to different policies. For example, remains of people should be returned immediately. And for those objects of wars should be prioritized. And for other objects, for example, objects obtained through seemingly legitimate measures, for example, donation or unfair trading that are obtained can maybe put on the list but not prioritized, but still returned. It is also necessary that countries should look into their laws and policies and make changes. For example, the laws on national properties cannot be transferred, types of laws. Also, we should make it clear maybe such objects should not be subject to the statute of limitation. I know there has been such regulations already, but not many members have signed on it. Also, for the soft laws, we need to include some of the pathways for how to improve community capacity building. For example, some of the objects cannot be returned due to the lack of clear ownership or clear barriers. Then maybe we should help the community and museums to work with each other. We should help communities to tell the story. I think that all of those things are worth doing. My suggestion is that the illegal transfer of colonial cultural relics is a historical injustice behavior. No matter what we do today, we cannot change the history. But if we can admit the mistake and correct its unjust consequences, then we can open up the new page for collaboration and development in the decolonization era. This will require the joint efforts of everyone. Also will require some innovation of the laws and legal measures. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Wang.
Very good suggestion for the ICOM. We even don't have the chair on the cultural heritage. I mean, in the ICOM border. So I mean, we start from her suggestion. 第二位演讲的是，我就用中文来讲啊。第二位演讲的是那个America Castillo 教授。
So the second speaker is Americo Castillo professor. He's going to talk about restitution from Latin America.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening. I'm very thankful for having been invited to this conversation, which I hope it's you are all interested as I am. So I will refer to coloniality and restitution from Latin American perspective. So the first thing I will do is share the image with you. So, as a former, I must confess, as a former attorney at law, I believe that legal instruments are only the beginning, at sometimes necessary beginnings, of an effort to formalize or encourage certain social behaviors, or rather impose social conducts which society in all its complexity sniffs like dogs do, to find out if they were passed in the benefit of the same species, or if they are rather the expression of conflicting or adverse interests. But even among those possible contradictions, UNESCO has been prolific in dictating guidelines and procedures in benefit of the conservation and fair management of cultural and natural heritage. I won't now quote that background legislation because all the eminent jurists will foreseeable do it, but you may be reassured that in Latin America we have also done our part. The UNESCO's conventions have been ratified by almost all countries of the regions, and most recently there were two convenings in Mexico, September last year, which made special reference to the discussion we are now having. One was the Mondiacult World Conference of Cultural Ministers, and the other one was the Ibero-American Museum's 10th Conference of all Spanish-speaking countries of the world. And they both referred to the theme, like, for example, Mondiacult Chapter 10 recommends, and I quote, expanding efforts to promote the protection, return, and restitution of cultural property, including in consultation with the populations concerned and with their free, prior, and informed consent. And the Ibero-American convening in chapters 3 and 9 recommends the incorporation of the decolonial perspective in the institutions and museum processes, and the emphasis on the solidarity values of ancestral knowledge and practices. Even if the World Conference resolution goes more in detail into the processes of restitution, it doesn't mean that it goes in depth into those knowledges. The Ibero-American Conference final statement goes to the core of the mandate of the 18 countries involved when recommending the incorporating the decolonial perspective in institutions and museum processes. In other words, first, we all need to understand the nature of the problem and the reasons to impulse actions to revert the conscious or unconscious acceptance of centuries of imposition of a racist frame of power still in operation. What is that decolonial perspective as seen from Latin America, and which have been the practical examples of the efforts, not always successful, to critically revert the scenario? Rita Segato, an Argentine anthropologist who has worked widely in Latin America over themes of coloniality and violence amongst women, she says, coloniality not only organizes the world economically in a proto-global market, but also organizes our subjectivity, dictating how to think, feel, and be in the world. The coloniality of power, of knowledge, of feeling, is a cognitive empire of Eurocentrism given by the moral superiority of the Europeans, which gives rise to modernity as a claim to universal knowledge. I think that this thought of Rita's condenses a lot of what we are talking about, because our work as museum leaders begins precisely at that point, in investigating how coloniality has been formed, how it has been constituted. That is, how in those processes of constitution it has removed alternative knowledge. The modernity machinery from the 6th century on to the present was constituted by cornering all existing knowledge, and not only that of the great civilizations, but of all cultural groups that preceded it, and the museum, as in many cases the church and the university, fulfilled a fundamental task in the founding of that Western civilization and the destitution of all the civilizations and of the other knowledge. Investigating then goes beyond tracing the genealogy of the museum from the cabinets of curiosities to today and its drifts from Europe to the Americas. Investigating is uncovering, removing the veil, its function in this operation of constitution removal. So, how do we set free from that code? How do we rethink it? Walter Mignolo, a great thinker of Argentine origin and working at Duke University in the USA, thinks that we need a gnosiological reconstruction of epistemology. And rather than trying to decolonize the museum, we should focus on decolonizing the idea we have of what the museum institution is, and on how to undertake decolonial tasks that contribute to restoring knowledge and building future knowledge according to different frames of values based on solidarity and accepting nature as part of and not alien of our own existence. Is a meteorite a cultural good? According to the Mocovi First Nation people of Argentina, it certainly is, as the one that grounded in their territory is believed to bring harmony to one of the most discriminated communities, renews fertility, and transmits heavenly powers to those who dance around it. A field of meteorites, Campo del Cielo, heavenly fields, in the province of Chaco, Argentina, where one of the biggest meteorites in the world has fallen, is in such way invested with cultural attributes as to have been claimed by Latin American contemporary artists to be taken to the 2022, last year's, Documenta Biennial at Kassel, Germany, to represent the Latin American culture, although its monumental weight would have been one of the impediments, and not to mention the local First Nations opposition to its removal from a sacred space. The unfair market transactions and spoliations of goods, despite their strong spiritual meaning for its owners, have a long history, mainly of artistic, historical, paleontological, ethnographic, or archaeological pieces. As we now see, also meteorites may be added to that list. They all require some type of predominance of power by the acquirer or spoiler, whether economic, political, military, or social. It is at that point that the colonial frame of power persists, unless in the case of voluntary donation of cultural goods as part of a community social phenomena, as studied by the anthropologist Marcel Mauss at his time, those forced appropriations disregard the powerful social and ceremonial value attached to those pieces and are labeled at fancy museums according to a colonial aesthetic pattern. To prevent those transactions, some countries of Latin America declare them as state ownership and require the public registration of those cultural goods possessed by civil citizens who can only transmit them by inheritance, but not buy, sell, import, or export them. In Argentina, a very strong campaign has been made, an advertising campaign was made public, which affected and was very well received, and in somehow made some of those who wanted to show their collections of archaeological and paleontological would be restrained from doing so. Illegal imports of archaeological goods from Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador were legally seized by the Argentine government and offered back to the countries to which they belong. In this case, restitution was not previously claimed by the Andean countries, but on the contrary, they were unexpected recipients of the offer of extraordinary collections which they had considered lost. The looting of fossils destined to commercial markets, such as the annual fossil market in Tucson, Arizona, the USA, determined the Argentine government to build a case at the Arizona Court of Justice to restitute a whole lippman full of scientific and cultural evidence illegally smuggled from paleontological sites, mainly of Patagonia, where they are part of its cultural landscape. Even if the states legislate and campaign, there is a question remaining. How do the descendants of the First Nations communities or mestizo cultures react in the persistence of colonial behavior, and which are their actual and legitimate demands? And furthermore, how do current citizens of all origins who inhabit our countries react to rooted colonial mandates? An interesting case linked to sacred ceremonial sacrifices done at the very high altitudes of the Andes Mountains, performed by the Incas around the 15th century, is now subject to contemporary discussions, and not only among archaeologists or indigenous groups, by all those concerned with climate change and social urgency, climate justice. The Inca Trail, declared World Heritage Landscape by UNESCO in 2014, points out specific human actions such as exceptional burial rituals performed by offering the lives of Inca youngsters of noble lineage in mountain peaks over 5,000 and up to 6,700 meters high, mostly of the south of their large empire, Ortihuantissuyo, probably as a tribute to the water provision for their sustainability. Those mummified corpses, originally considered messengers of the superior forces of nature, were found by archaeologists in recent decades wrapped together with material representations of the Inca Empire, golden llamas, figures of men, Amazonian feather tufts, carved ocean valves, and illustrated textiles, and were brought down to urban museums or universities for further studies and exhibitions. The unconsented indigenous inhabitants of the region are now blaming those practices for the desertification of their land and claim the human remains and objects to be taken back to the sacred sites. So much is still to be learned about those ecosystems and cosmovisions in terms of harmony. Also, the example of the Calawaya herbal knowledge of Bolivia, also declared as intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO in 2003, speaks of a mouth-to-mouth transmission of indigenous medical healing that have cured generations of people and requires safeguarding from undiscriminated medical labs business. The materialization of this legal or safeguarding provisions in Latin America is far from reaching the whole of the 50 million indigenous peoples holders of a knowledge that needs to be reconstituted. In short, the word restitution involves values of respect to diversity, equity, and justice that, when violated, may affect communities within their own national context or victimized by the, what is said, collapse of global biodiversity or the power of an economic system dependent on the fallacy of endless growth, consumption, and debt. Also, colonial mandates may be rooted in such a way within a particular society, conveying racism and injustice many centuries after foreign political domination seems over. Museums are not totally aware of the fact that they were created as important components of those hegemonic roles. And there is no such thing as a post-colonial period as if it were only a neutral field of study. There is a colonial condition called coloniality, as first described by the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, which still today cancels knowledge and promotes races. And museums have the opportunity and responsibility to promote a unique discussion held by the polysemic and, in the best of cases, polyphonic collections. Universality of laws are now in crisis, as also is endless global growth. The initiative for restitution is not limited to material goods, and we have given examples of how objects are not cultural according to the colonial periodical justification, whether it be artistic, historical, or ethnographic, and rather respond to the feelings, use, and descriptions awarded by diverse peoples, but must be accompanied by the most important of restitutions, that of the production of knowledge unfairly cancelled. Legal dispositions may only be legitimate if they respond to a mature discussion and necessary efforts for consent among diverse ways of understanding this extraordinary and unequal planet. So, thank you again, and I hope that this conversation may help to the aims we have just described of understanding this extraordinary and unequal planet. Good evening.
Thank you so much, Americo. You give a very good example of how what happened in the Latin America. We thought we have done so many jobs on that project, but his idea is we still a lot of work are waiting for us. So the third speaker is Professor Duan Yong. Please welcome Duan, Professor Duan.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to represent myself and Professor Zhang Weiqi to give the talk. We'll talk about examining the museum decolonization and semi-colonial. So we'll first look at the declaration, the Universal Declaration, and also the changes of the attitude in the recent 10 years. The loss of cultural objects is a common international phenomenon that has accomplished colonization and globalization over the last 3 centuries. Colonies lost a large number of representative cultural objects in the context of unjust international political and economic order. With the investigation of UNESCO project, we know that it's still the number 3 issue. So the loss of cultural objects and the return of such objects are historical issues, also current issues. We all know that the international society have 2 laws on this one. One is the 1970 Convention and then the 1995 Convention. They both play the role in terms of repatriation of the cultural objects. However, they also are bound for how long it will be effective, because that will only apply to activities or objects after the enactment of this law. Before, it will not apply. Also, it has limited application in terms of its space. For example, the 95 Convention has very limited number of countries that are included in terms of the inflow of the object of nations. Also, it's limited in terms of the application of the objects. It's restricted to cultural objects of special interest to the countries which lost artifacts. So there's that regulation as well. So in terms of time, space, and object, we see the limitations of such conventions. In 2002, Greece sought repatriation of objects from UK, and there's a declaration on the importance and the value of universal museums from that event. So cultural objects have been viewed as owned by the whole human beings, and therefore the request from Greece has been rejected by UK, and this really has aroused lots of attention. There also has been the declaration and a view sharing of some of the important figures on this event. I, therefore, have paid attention to the loss and the repatriation of cultural objects from there on as well. Declaration on the importance and value of universal museums have been viewed as a barrier for return of such cultural relics. But now, if we look at it, you really see the meaning behind, because we do notice from that declaration that there is the attention around the world to the loss and repatriation of such cultural relics. We know that such objects concentrate in Europe and America, so they've been in the spotlight for a long time. And because of the ongoing efforts as well as the pressure from the international society, now in recent years, we have seen the focus of the research on such objects of colonial backgrounds. For example, France, Germany, and Netherlands have really changed their attitude toward colonial context objects. For example, France in 2017 have made the presidential remark. They have changed the attitude in terms of how they view such objects. They now want to return such objects versus they originally claimed that such objects would not be or could not be transferred. For Germany, the Museum Association in 2018 also produced a guideline on dealing with collections from colonial contexts, also updated this guideline later. And this guideline is supported by the person in charge of culture in Europe. In Netherlands, there's also the attitude made. The Dutch government announced that it would unconditionally return the illegally obtained objects during the Dutch colonies. Even for UK, who has always been holding a very tough attitude, now has returned some of the banning bronzes. So all of those cases show us that the international society has somewhat formed a consensus on returning colonial background or context objects. So now, let me talk about the return of lost Chinese cultural relics. According to my own research, if we look at such objects from China, it totals about 15 million. Many of them are commodity products or art products that are legally traded. So they accounted for 90% of the total. But about 10% of them, that is 1.5 million, are illegally lost cultural products. So they are mostly in the first half of the 20th century as well as the second half of the 19th century. The Chinese government has joined the 1970 and 1995 convention, but to compensate the limitation of such conventions, we've also signed 20 bilateral agreements with other countries to ban the trading of such illegally obtained objects. For the illegally lost cultural objects, we think that we should trace and work on the repatriation and restitution of such cultural objects. But however, due to all kinds of reasons, now we have only three major options for such return. One is to purchase, the other is for donation, and the other is the restitution. For purchase, that means that under certain conditions, for objects that cannot be returned through legal or diplomatic measures, then we can try to get them back through purchase. And we have many examples of such practice. But for the illegally lost cultural objects, such purchase has some issues. That is, you are spending to buy back what you have lost. This is actually going to be a secondary harm to the emotions. This could also encourage more doings of illegal trading of such objects. For donation, it refers to the return of stolen Chinese cultural relics by overseas Chinese, international friends, foreign governments, and museums as a benevolent gift or friendly diplomatic gesture. This kind of buy and return arrangement is also very common. So this is kind of in between the first measure and the third measure, and this is also very common. For recovery, it is the way to resolve disputes over the ownership of lost cultural property in accordance with international conventions and national laws. They are most consistent with the relevant international conventions and ethical principles. But however, It is also very limited to the limitations of conventions, and therefore it's most difficult for the repatriation of such objects. Some of them are voluntary by the other countries. So this really shows the consensus and the friendship among countries. This is meaningful for banning on the trading of such illegally obtained objects. From 1949 to 2019, China has successfully facilitated the return of more than 300 batches of cultural relics, totaling 150,000 pieces, through various means. In recent years, we've also seen numerous batches of illegally lost cultural objects that are returning. So the Chinese government and the relevant departments are really, the Chinese government, the relevant parties, and the public are all paying attention to this effort, and therefore we've achieved what we have achieved. So now let me talk about the semi-colonial topic in the context of the loss of Chinese cultural relics. This concept actually originated from the 2018 guidelines on dealing with collections from colonial context from Germany. So this would cover collections from formal colonial ruling context and informal colonial ruling context, and those that reflect colonialism. Such recovery is limited to the limitations of the conventions. And it's an effort through ethics of the human being, which in return helps the laws to develop. The Chinese people and the world at large really have the consensus on what is right and have such ethics. Since 1840, China has been in a state of internal and external turmoil, which is a society of semi-colonial society. To the left, you can see the drawing of Dan. So you could see that we really see the force and impact from the forces from Europe. The Qing and Ming dynasty government lacks authority, the social and economic conditions are grim, and large amounts of cultural heritage have been plundered, stolen, and lost. So it has many similarities to the background of informal colonial rule. I want to reference the Tang Dynasty Honglujing stone as an example. The Tang Honglujing stone was carved in the early 8th century. A Chinese officer in the Tang Dynasty was sent out on an inspection tour around today's Lu Shun by the emperor. He dug wells to commemorate. He inscribed certain characters on the stone. So this is actually very valuable inscription. In 1904 to 1905, we have had the Russia-Japan War, and part of the war took place in Liaodong region of China. Japan defeated Russia, and then they used such stone as the victory of war, as the spoil of war, and then sent back to their own country. And it's placed in the imperial palace. So it's not the property of the government, but of the royal family. The stone is obtained during the time when the Chinese government has lost authority of its land, which should be returned. Shanghai University Center of Cultural Overseas Cultural Heritages have also studied such cases. Since the 1990s, the Chinese public have made claims of return of this stone. Such requests have received support from certain Japanese people. In 2021, professors and lawyers in Japan founded Association for the Promotion of the Return of Chinese Cultural Relics in Japan.
And they appealed to the Japanese government to restitute the cultural relics that have been taken during the wars with China. Last year in Japan, in the hospital, they also organized an assembly and also to disseminate their appeal. As the researcher, I believe, and also I hope that under the adequate reconciliation between the general public, between China and Japan, this Tang Dynasty Honglu Jin stone will be recovered and returned to China. And also in 2019, the UNESCO adopted 14 November as International Against Illicit Trafficking Cultural Property. In 2021, 14th November, Shanghai University hosted the first China Forum on International Against Illicit Trafficking in Cultural Property, together with the special exhibition of International Responsibility for Human Heritage. Right now, we are hosting the Museums, Decolonisation, Restitution, Global Conversation at the Shanghai University. We are very happy to have this opportunity to exchange and discuss with my colleagues across the world. I also want to call upon the international community to pay due attention to the lost cultural relics from the semi-colonial backgrounds, while also promote restitution of cultural objects from colonial background, to jointly promote fair justice that takes into account both history and reality by strengthening exchanges, enhancing understanding, building mutual trust, and carrying out cooperation. Thank you very much. That's all from me. Thank you, Professor Duan, for your wonderful briefing. He shared with us the works that have been done by Shanghai University. He also raised up the important concept of the semi-colonial cultural heritage. We're going to have a very wonderful dialogue between the speakers. Now I hand over to Professor Anlai Shun to moderate the next part. I will hand over to Professor An to have the panel discussion.